Thank you for the introduction. Great that you made it this early after pie drinks to the conference and to my talk. Would really like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for having me to do a talk on this. I'm going to run through a couple of slides, basically showing off certain communities that we have in the larger Python community, and basically talk about things that I have done in these communities. And the point there is not so much to basically, show everyone what I did, but the point is to maybe give you some motivation for you to find things how you can help the Python community grow and how you can help, make Python a bigger thing in this world. So first, a speaker introduction. So I'm Marc-André Lemburg. I have a company, a consulting company called Egenix. We do Python projects and we do consulting for companies wanting to use Python or helping them with their Python projects. I'm also working as a consulting CTO for startups, for example, or a senior solution architect. But for this talk, it's more important to look at what I've done in the Python community. So I am a EuroPython Society fellow. So EuroPython Society is the organization that's running EuroPython. I've been chair of that society for the last 5 years. I stepped down in August last year. I'm also a Python Software Foundation fellow. So one of the founders, actually, in 2001. Was on the board for many, many years. And I am a Python core developer. So maybe that's more interesting for you. So let's look for the agenda. So I'm going to do a short introduction, what I want to talk about, then show you some things where you can help Python grow. I mean, I'll just take it as a given that you would like to do that because you're sitting here. And then I'm going to talk about a few lessons I learned. So basically things that I have experienced, and maybe you can take those things that I learned and maybe not make the same mistakes as I did. So how can you help Python and the community grow? Many people think that they have to be a good C programmer, for example, to help with CPython, to be a core developer, or maybe just to contribute to Python by sending in patches. Well, that's of course true, but it's not the only thing that you can do. You can also help in lots of other ways. And there are actually quite a few things where the Python community needs more help, especially in areas that don't have anything to do with coding. So for example, if you want to do marketing or if you want to do documentation, these things are things that we really need in the Python community because we don't have many people who are good at these things. And maybe for some of the developers in the community, it's also the case that they don't really like these things. Like, for example, if you have a group of developers and you tell them they need to do some marketing, they're going to just run away, right? So it's difficult to find these people. Whereas I very much know that we do have people who are good at marketing, for example, or good at design or event organization, but not necessarily, good and versed C programmers to be able to help with CPython. So if there's something on this list here, and this is just an example list, where you're good at and where you think you could help, then please do consider contributing with your skill set to the Python community. Right, so how did I start to work with Python and learn about Python? I started in 1994, so as you can probably tell, I'm quite old. I discovered Python on this OS2 Hops CD, it was called in the days, which was a collection of open source software they gave out, I think, quarterly. And I scrolled through the list of Python of the list of programming languages, and I knew Perl, but and then I found Python, and I never had heard of it before. And then I took an afternoon and sat down and ran through the tutorial by Guido, and that basically caught me on, and since then, I've been using Python. So I was a C programmer before. I still am a C programmer. And I very much like Python because it made things so much easier. And from that point on, what I did is I always turned to C if I wanted speed, but I did all the high-level stuff, all the management stuff of the coding. I did that in Python, and then wrote extensions to make everything, work together. So it was interesting times back then in the late 90s, because there were lots and lots of very, very smart people. You saw Raymond yesterday in the keynote. He's one of them. You've probably seen Guido before. Maybe some of you have seen Tim Peters. I don't know. These are like the half-genius kind of type of people. So they are really, really smart people. And it was a real pleasure to work in that community in those early days. And the community was very small, so everyone knew each other. You can just get together, and they had smaller conferences. And everything was by email, basically, or mailing lists. What was nice was there was lots of potential for improvement. So it really made sense to enter that space and enter the community and start working for Python to help it grow. What I did in those days was I started to look at the C Python implementation, and I started to consider improvements. I wrote a couple of extensions in those days. They were called MX extensions. MX simply because after a while we found that there were too many naming collisions in the package name, so I had to put something in front of it. So for example, datetime, there were many datetime implementations in those days. And in order to avoid the collisions, I put this MX in front of it, and so the mx.datetime is the actual name of the package. I worked on the Unicode integration and the codex subsystem in Python, so if you use Unicode, yeah, that's my fault. So if you have trouble with codecs and you get, strange code encoding errors, then that's my fault as well. I also contributed the platform module that some of you may know. And I wrote a PyBench, which nowadays is not used anymore because it was a micro benchmark that I did for CPython. The background there is that I wanted to make Python faster. And of course, in order to be able to check whether a change actually made Python faster or slower, I had to have a micro benchmark to do that. And I basically collected all the different benchmarks in that package. And I did many smaller things in Python. Like for example, well, nowadays you don't have that anymore, but the %r, to get if you format a string and you do %r and then %object, for example, and you get the representation of the object in that string formatting. That's one of those small things that I did as well. Plus, I'm the editor of the PythonDB API. So if you know that one, if you've ever dealt with databases in Python, then you probably use that. Right, that was core development. I've been doing that for many, many years, and then after a while, I basically was not involved actively anymore. Right now, for example, I'm just doing advisory work, so I'm just basically helping people understand context of where stuff came from. In 2001, as I mentioned, the Python Software Foundation was founded, and the idea behind that was that Guido wanted to basically have a legal backup for the software, and also some kind of body that could possibly take over in case he gets hit by a bus. I mean, that was the saying back then. And so in 2001 at the IPC 9 conference in Los Angeles, I think it was, we founded the PSF. And the original idea was to put all the IP rights in Python, like the copyright and also the trademark, into the PSF, and then eventually, have it find other things that needed to be done as well. Now, as you probably know, the PSF underwrites PyCon, the PyCon US conference, and that's also the main source of revenue nowadays. So basically, they organize the PyCon conference, and uh, make a good chunk of money every year on that, and that chunk of money helps pay the staff that the PSF has and helps pay things like, for example, maintaining the trademarks, registering trademarks, and many other things, marketing material, for example. Something else I did was I registered the pycon.org domain. So you probably also have used that one in a couple of ways. And I had it for, I don't know, probably a decade or so, and then I signed it over to the PSF. I registered that domain because at that time I was working on another project. I'm going to come to the next slide. And we had a bit of trouble finding a right domain for that conference, so I started to use this one, and then thought that, well, pycon.org could be something that unites the community, and so instead of just giving it to the PSF for them to use it for the US PyCon, I very much emphasized on using subdomains for the various conferences. So we have us.pycon, for example, for the US one. We have de.pycon.org for the German one, and so on. So we have there are lots and lots of subdomains that are used on that domain, and that really helped a lot to make the conference space grow in the Python community, because there was this uniting kind of domain available. And I also did lots of other things. For example, I started to work on marketing material. What you see here in the upper right, this is a Python brochure I was working on. So we created material that you could actually hand out to, for example, managers who, at that time at least, did not necessarily go to the internet to inform themselves. And of course, there was a Python website, but the Python website wasn't really geared towards people like managers. So there was no executive summary, for example, on that page. There were no showcases. You couldn't find good examples where Python was being used, because in those early days, the early 2000s, the situation very often was when you went to a new customer, and you want to convince them that Python is a good language to implement their solution in, you always had trouble, because they were asking, what's Python? They usually didn't know anything about Python, hadn't heard about Python before. So the brochure really helped a lot in that space. Not necessarily everywhere, because in some places people did not really like brochures. I know, for example, that in Germany, if you don't have a brochure, then basically you don't exist. So it's very important to have something like that. I know in the US, people hate brochures because they don't like that tree, so they prefer to have everything online. But it's a cultural thing, and that's also something that I learned over all these years, that you have to be aware of the cultural differences around the world. Not everyone thinks or believes in the same things, or does certain things in the same ways. So you always have to consider different approaches to this kind of thing, to market your to market your ideas. So there are a couple of other things here on this list as well. The job board, you might know, where you can get Python jobs. I restarted that project. Event calendars, if you see the event calendars that you have on python.org, that's something that I'm working on still. Trademarks, I'm one of the committee members there in the trademarks committee. And the Python wiki I'm maintaining as well, so a couple of things. Then in 2002, we thought in Europe that we needed a big Python conference, because in those days, the only conference that the community had was a large commercial conference in the US run by Fortech. Oh, just 10 minutes left. Okay, I need to speed up. So we decided to start EuroPython, and in 2002 we then made it happen, Charleroi in Belgium. That was a really nice event, and we had lots of people coming. Not in terms of numbers, but lots of also important people came. So we had Guido there. We had I don't remember whether we had Raymond there, but we had lots of other people from the Python community, well-known names at that conference. And that was the start of a conference series. So since then, we've been running EuroPython every single year. It was the first major community-run Python conference. So even before PyCon US. PyCon US started a year later. And of course, after a while, we found that doing this as a hobby wouldn't, work anymore, because of course, if you run a large conference, and EuroPython is a large conference nowadays, there's lots of financial risk associated with that, and so we had to form a EuroPython society, which is similar to the Python Software Foundation, only that it's based in Europe. And we took the society through a couple of rounds of changes, organizational changes. We grew the organization. We basically turned it into a fully remote organization. So nowadays we can run everything remotely, including the conference itself. I mean, not only virtually, but also, do all the organization remotely. So you don't have to have a local team anymore to actually put a EuroPython conference on. And we've extended the EuroPython Society mission to cover basically support for Python. So we're kind of like doing the same thing as the PSF, but with a more regional focus on Europe. So if you have a conference or you have a project and you want funding, for example, for that, you can approach the EuroPython Society for grants. And there is quite a bit of money available, and we're very open to funding these things. In 2012, I felt that we needed, I needed something that's a bit smaller than all these things, right? So I started this user group in Düsseldorf. Düsseldorf is where I live, where I come, don't come from, but where I've been the last few decades. We found that it was, it started very small. It still is very small. We just have maybe like 25 people or so coming to the meetings, but we do have 1,200 or so meetup members, so quite a few people know about us. This is basically just a fun project, and this is something, for example, if you want to start doing something in your area, your city maybe, then that's a perfect thing to do. So just start a meetup, right? And then you can grow things from there. You can start with a meetup and then turn it into a conference, for example. So this is a short overview of the stuff that I've done, the various positions I held. Now let's get to the second part, lessons learned. So it wasn't always, a straight line here, as you can see. So there were challenges, of course, along the way. So one big challenge for myself was time management. If you're doing stuff that you really like, then you tend to spend lots of time on that. And of course, it sometimes, becomes difficult because you still have a day job, right? You have a family, maybe. And you have to manage all these things and have to, put the right emphasis on different things. So if you want to enter this kind of space, you always have to be aware that you shouldn't spend too much time on it. You should also focus on other things. There's another paradox I ran into, which is you actually have to fight for doing good stuff. So let's say you have a good idea. For example, this Python brochure thing. It took literally, I think, 2 years to convince the other board members in the PSF to do this, because the PSF traditionally is a very US-centric kind of organization, and so the US, they have different ideas about these brochures. And it took a long time to do that. That's something that you will probably also run into. So you have to be aware that there will be discussions around these things. There usually are strong egos in the ecosystem, in the community. It's something that you have to deal with. It's something that you can deal with. It's not impossible, right? And if you're aware of these things, then it also helps you not get frustrated too early, at least, right? So that's something that you need to consider. The other thing is motivation. Basically, the motivation has to come from yourself. So if you're entering the space thinking that you will get lots of recognition for whatever you're doing, this is likely not going to happen. It may happen, of course, and if it happens, it's a really good thing. But you shouldn't really bet on this. So you have to find your own, I don't know, I call it fusion reactors, so energy source basically to run these things, to do these things. You will also most likely not make a lot of money on these things, right? So you can do that indirectly. You can use the recognition or the awareness of people for what you're doing to maybe have a better following in your business. But there really isn't a lot. So it's not something that you do to make a living or to raise a lot of money. Endurance is something that you need. So you really have to, stick to it. Even if it doesn't go, if it's not easy, even if it's boring. For example, if you do conference organization, lots of boring things that you have to do. You just have to, be aware of these things, consider them, and they won't last forever. I mean, you are going to get to the end goal. But there may be difficult times, so that's something that you do have to consider and be aware of. And then I already talked about recognition. You shouldn't really expect a lot of recognition. What I found, which really helps, is to reward yourself. So let's say you've put on a great conference, right? You maybe get a few thank yous from the attendees. And that's about it in terms of recognition. So what I did, I maybe bought myself a new notebook, or went on a trip somewhere, or maybe just did something else to just reward myself. And that's a good way to motivate yourself again to continue with these things. And of course, if you do get recognition, then by all means, put these things on your CV. Let's say you get an award, or you're confusing me with those sheets. Dealing with pushbacks is another thing that unfortunately happens. So basically, people are not all alike. There will always be many people who don't like your ideas, and you have to deal with that. Two things I can recommend. One thing is that you don't rely on other people. You just do it yourself and find maybe new people to help you, which is very much possible because Python is a very large community and there's likely more people wanting to do similar things. The other thing that you can do is you put your ideas on hold. For example, this %R that I mentioned early on, that was something that Guido didn't like in the first run. And 2 years later, he found it, extremely nice idea. So, things like this happen. Perspectives change, people change, so just try again. And unfortunately, sometimes you also have to deal with attacks, because if you're working in open source, everything is in the open, and you created an attack surface. And this is unfortunate, but this is something that you also have to consider. The best thing that you can do about this is, I found, is that you just, stay calm, try to slow down things. For example, if you're having serious discussions with people, try to not react too quickly, take a step back, and depending on how these attackers work, they will probably just lose interest after a while. Fortunately, there are only very, very few people of these kinds in the Python community. So maybe I experienced probably a handful. All the rest are just, excellent people. So this doesn't happen too often. Right, so let's just do a quick summary. Main takeaways. It's very easy to find something to work on, because you will probably have skill sets that many other people don't have. And so it's very, very much worth it to invest your time. But please do something that you really enjoy. And like I said, reward yourself, because that really helps. And of course, never stop to learn and always try out new things. And that was it. Thank you.
So, thanks, first of all. And we have a couple of questions. So the first question is, if all the budget for Python comes from the sold PyCon US tickets, did it survive the pandemic? Sorry. Yeah.
So the pandemic was an issue because especially PyCon US was already scheduled, and so they had to cancel the event. They had to wait until the very last minute because due to the contractual situation that they had, the only way to get out of those contracts was by the government or the I think it was the state saying that it's not allowed to run these events in person. And only then they were able to get out of the contracts and then postpone to the next year, and then again to the next year, and So they didn't take a huge hit. The PyCon US conference, I don't know the numbers nowadays, but it used to be around like maybe 1 or 2 million budget for the conference. So it's quite a large figure. But the PSF does have enough, money in the bank. I don't know how much. You can look on the website. They probably have a report somewhere. But it's definitely more than another 1 or 2 million that they have in the bank to sustain these things.
Here's another question from Alessio. Thanks for the talk. Is there one thing that you would like to do in a different way based on how it went? Code, conferences, communications, etc.?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the things that I would have done differently probably is I would have put more focus on the marketing side of things very early in the process. I think that's the main thing, because in the early days there was, we only had developers. We didn't even have designers. The only designer that we had in the community was Guido's brother, just from Russell. He designed the first logo that we had for Python. And then later on, when we changed to this plus kind of sign with the two snakes, that was designed by someone else, Tim Parkin, I think from the UK, but I don't remember. He designed that logo, and that was basically it in terms of designers, right, in those days. And this is something that is become better, and the communities are focusing more on design. For example, if you see the very nice designs that you have here in PyCon Italy, those are amazing, I think. But in those days we didn't have that, and it would have made a huge difference because, even though developers usually don't like marketing very much and don't like to be in that space, or sales for that matter, it's definitely something that you need if you want to be successful in the industry.
So here's the last question. You talked about egos. How do you protect the community from toxic leaders? How did you manage to be an inclusive leader?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So it's leadership is difficult in open source. Leadership is something that many of us have not really learned. So we just gotten into that role, and then we suddenly had to deal with that. I had a whole number of slides in this talk. It's a longer version of the talk available. And I had a couple of slides on leadership. So it's something that you really have to think about. It's something that you need to be aware of, that you can get into these roles when you enter the space. For example, let's say you run a conference, then all of a sudden you have 20 people to manage, and maybe you're not a manager, right? And you have to deal with that. And sometimes I don't think the issue is so much what was mentioned in the question, toxic leadership. I think it's more that people are not really familiar with that role, and it may seem like they are toxic, or because simply they maybe don't communicate in an ideal way. I can say that for myself. I mean, I ran into this role basically through these things that I did. And it wasn't always easy, right? And you suddenly meet different egos, different people in your teams, and you have to deal with situations that you might have not encompassed before. So it takes a learning curve, and I think the people in the community, if they understand that the leaders that they suddenly have in a certain group are not necessarily experienced, I think that will make things easier for the leaders as well. And so these situations where this impression gets formed that you have a toxic leader is basically dealt with by having respect for each other in both directions, and also understand that the people there, the leaders, are not perfect. People for some reason always expect leaders to be like the perfect leaders, perfect people, very much aware of everything, and that's not the case. I mean, they're just humans, right?
Thank you very much, Marc-André, and thanks everybody. And our host is going to be around, so if you have any other additional question, you can ask him directly. So thank you very much.